Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're looking into a topic that really challenges how we think about the very basics of family and life itself. Assisted reproductive technology, or RT. This tech has kind of radically shifted the old ways, the time-tested order of having children and becoming parents.
It really has. We've gone way beyond traditional conception.
Mm.
I mean, technology now lets doctors fertilize eggs in a lab, freeze embryos, sometimes for years, and even, well, outsource pregnancy through surrogacy. And while RT is, frankly, a miracle for millions facing infertility, it does immediately throw up these huge ethical questions.
Like what, exactly?
Well, questions about what family even means now, the moral status of embryos, and where the boundaries of reproductive rights actually lie. So our mission today is to sort of unpack these complex arguments step by step, giving you a clearer map of this whole bioethical area.
Okay, let's start with the foundation then. In vitro fertilization, IVF, first, infertility, clinically speaking, that's not being able to get pregnant after a year of trying, right? And RT, like IVF, is different from the more conventional stuff like drugs or surgery.
That's right. IVF literally means in glass. It's the cornerstone. It's the process of uniting sperm and egg outside the body in a lab dish. It's actually a pretty involved multi-step cycle. Yeah. All designed to, maximize the chances of pregnancy.
Right. Let's walk through those steps, maybe focusing on the parts that really spark the ethical debates.
Okay. So first up is ovarian stimulation, sometimes called superovulation. Basically, drugs are used to make the woman's ovaries produce multiple eggs, not just the one you'd get in a normal cycle.
And that's key ethically, the multiple eggs part.
Exactly, because it directly leads to creating multiple embryos, which is, a central point of contention later on.
Okay. So after the eggs are retrieved, that's a minor surgery, you said.
Yeah, outpatient surgery. Then comes insemination and fertilization. The eggs are mixed with sperm. Sometimes, especially if there's an issue with the sperm, experts use something called ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection.
ICSI, what's that involve?
It's where they actually take a single sperm and inject it directly into the egg. It's very precise. Helps ensure fertilization happens.
Got it. So now we have these fertilized eggs, embryos developing in the lab. What's ethically important about this culture stage?
Well, this is where selection really comes in. After a few days of development, they can do Preimplantation Genetic Diagnosis, or PGD. It's a screening technique. It lets them check the embryo for specific genetic diseases before it's even transferred to the uterus.
Ah, so that's the moment technology allows for selection. And that raises moral questions right there.
Precisely. Then, finally, one or sometimes more embryos are transferred into the uterus, hoping to start a pregnancy.
The impact is huge, obviously. You mentioned millions helped, hundreds of thousands in the U.S. having kids they might not have otherwise had, biologically related kids. But the flip side, the costs, the trade-offs, they seem significant.
Oh, they are. Financially, it's a massive burden. You're looking at, what, $10,000 to $15,000 for just one cycle? And success rates, well, they vary dramatically, especially with age.
How dramatically?
Well, for a woman under 35, the chance of a live birth per cycle is actually pretty good, over 55%. But get to age 41 or 42, and that success rate just plummets down to around 13%.
Wait, hold on. If the chance drops that much, is there an ethical question about, selling these really expensive cycles to older women when the odds are so low?
That's definitely a major point of discussion. Issues of justice, informed consent, truth-telling within the industry. It's tricky. And beyond the money, there are health risks, too. For the woman, Ovarian Hyperstimulation Syndrome can be serious. And because doctors often transfer multiple embryos to increase the odds.
Right, you get multiple pregnancies, twins, triplets.
Exactly, which carries its own set of risks, higher rates of premature birth, low birth weight, potential birth defects, things like that.
And that leads us to another big one, doesn't it? The leftover embryos, the ones that aren't transferred.
Yes. The unused cryopreserved embryos, there are hundreds of thousands of them in storage, often because the parents have finished their family, or maybe they've divorced or just changed their minds.
So what happens to them? It sounds like a huge moral and legal mess.
It is. There are basically four main options on the table. Keep storing them, which costs money, donate them to other infertile couples, donate them for scientific research, or destroy them.
And the core of that debate is?
It all comes down to the moral status you assign to that embryo. If you believe an embryo has moral worth, maybe even rights, right from conception, well, then destroying it or using it for research becomes morally problematic, if not outright wrong for some.
There's a specific case using PGD that really highlights this, isn't there? The savior sibling.
Yes, that's a really complex application. PGD is used not just to screen out disease, but to actively select an embryo that's a tissue match, say, for bone marrow for an existing sick child.
So you're creating a baby specifically to help another child.
Essentially, yes, to be a donor. The embryo is chosen for its tissue compatibility. The big ethical worry, pointed out by places like the Hastings Center, is the potential harm to that new child. What if they grow up feeling they were only created, only wanted to be a savior, not valued for themselves as an individual?
That feels like it could undermine their sense of self-worth, their autonomy.
Exactly. Treating them as a means to an end right from the start, it's a deep concern.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. From the lab to, well, the complexities of who carries the child. Let's talk about surrogacy. So surrogacy is when a woman agrees to carry a pregnancy for someone else and then gives the baby to them after birth, right?
That's the basic idea. But we need to distinguish between two main types. There's traditional surrogacy, that's the older form, less common now. In that case, the surrogate uses her own egg, and it's fertilized usually by artificial insemination with the intended father's sperm. So she's both the genetic and the gestational mother.
Okay, genetic and gestational. And the other type.
That's gestational surrogacy. This is much more common today, partly because it's legally a bit clearer. Here, an embryo is created using IVF with eggs and sperm from the intended parents, or maybe donors, and then transferred to the surrogate. So the surrogate carries the pregnancy, but she has no genetic connection to the child. She's only the gestational mother.
Why are those distinctions so important?
Because when disputes happen, and they do, you can suddenly have claims from potentially three different parents: the genetic parents, the gestational parent, and the intended social or rearing parents. It gets complicated fast.
And this brings us to that really heated debate around commercial surrogacy. Is paying the surrogate just fair compensation, or is it fundamentally baby selling?
That's the crux of it. Philosopher Elizabeth Anderson makes a powerful argument against it. She says commercial surrogacy brings market norms, profit, efficiency, treating things as disposable into the realm of parenthood, where norms of love and commitment should rule. She argues it treats children like products to be bought and sold, and the woman's reproductive labor as a commodity, which, in her view, degrades both.
That's strong critique. But there are defenses too, right? Arguments based on freedom, maybe fairness.
Absolutely. Thinkers like Laura Purdy and Bonnie Steinbach push back. They argue the payment isn't for the baby. It's compensation for the surrogate's significant time, effort, the physical risks she undertakes, the discomfort of pregnancy.
So more like paying for a service.
Kind of. Steinbach compares it to prenatal adoption. The surrogate is being compensated for giving up her potential future parental rights, not for the child itself. And Purdy adds, look, surrogacy provides a really valuable service to people who desperately want children. We don't expect doctors or teachers to work purely out of altruism, do we? Why demand it only of surrogates?
It really came to a head in that famous case from the 80s, didn't it? The Baby M case.
Oh, yes. 1985.
Mm.
Mary Beth Whitehead. She was a traditional surrogate, used her own egg for the Stearns. After the baby was born, she bonded with the child and changed her mind, refused to give her up. It became this huge, messy, legal battle.
What was the outcome? I remember it being quite controversial.
Very. The New Jersey Supreme Court actually voided the surrogacy contract itself. They said it violated public policy, essentially calling it illegal baby selling. But, and this is the twist, they then decided custody based on the best interests of the child. And based on that standard, they awarded custody to the Stearns, the intended parents. Whitehead was recognized as the legal mother, but only got visitation rights. So the contract was invalid, but the biological and gestational mother still lost custody. It highlighted the huge legal confusion and the tension between contracts and maternal bonds.
Wow. Okay, moving from selecting embryos and carrying pregnancies to, well, the next frontier, maybe. Cloning. Human reproductive cloning, making a genetic copy of an adult. It causes this immediate, almost visceral negative reaction in a lot of people. But you mentioned there's often a scientific misunderstanding fueling that.
Yes, a really fundamental one. It's this myth of genetic determinism, the idea that our genes dictate everything about us. People imagine cloning, say, Einstein and getting another Einstein destined to follow the same path. But science, like the National Academy of Sciences report, is really clear. That's just not how it works.
So the clone wouldn't actually be Einstein?
No, not at all. They'd share the same genes, sure. But everything else, their environment, upbringing, nutrition, education, even random chance and development, would make them a completely unique individual. Think of it more like a delayed identical twin. Genetically similar, but a different person living in a different time.
Okay, if it's not creating carbon copies, why would anyone even argue for human cloning?
Well, proponents, like John Robertson, often frame it in terms of procreative liberty. That's the basic freedom people have to choose whether or not to have children. Robertson's point is, if you accept that fundamental freedom, then it should probably cover using new technologies like cloning, unless you can show it causes substantial, definite harm. And potential benefits are sometimes cited, like, well, maybe overcoming infertility if a couple has no eggs or sperm at all, or avoiding passing on a serious genetic disease, or even theoretically creating that perfectly matched organ donor, the later twin idea again.
All right. But the arguments against cloning seem pretty strong, too. They focus on risks and maybe rights.
Definitely. The most immediate argument is practical. Safety. Animal cloning still has really high rates of failure, miscarriage, birth defects.
Huh.
So attempting it in humans now would be wildly unethical purely on safety grounds. Beyond safety, the philosophical arguments often raise two main points. One, this idea of a right to a unique identity, which, as we discussed, is based on that flawed genetic determinism idea.
And the other one?
The right to an open future. This argument suggests that a clone, knowing their genetic blueprint comes from someone who's already lived, might feel their life path is somehow predetermined, less open, less free.
Their future doesn't feel like their own.
Right. They might feel overshadowed or that their choices don't matter as much. But here's where ethicist Dan Brock offers a sharp critique. Brock says, look, if the clone feels their future is closed off, that's a psychological harm, certainly. But it's based on the false belief in genetic determinism. Their future is, in reality, open. So while the anxiety might be real, it doesn't mean a genuine right has been violated because the premise, a closed future, is false.
That's subtle. It links back to something called the non-identity problem, doesn't it? Can you explain that briefly?
Sure. The non-identity problem is a real philosophical puzzle. It asks, if someone's very existence depends on a choice we might see as ethically questionable, like being created as a clone or as a savior sibling, can we say that person has been harmed by being brought into existence under those conditions? I mean, the alternative for that specific person wasn't a better life, it was no life at all. So is a life, even one with potential burdens or created for specific reasons, worse than non-existence? It makes judging harm really tricky.
Okay, these are incredibly complex issues. How do the big, established moral theories help us navigate this?
Well, we can look at it through a few main lenses. First, utilitarianism. A utilitarian asks, do the overall benefits outweigh the harms? So does the happiness gained by infertile couples having children outweigh the risks, the costs, the loss of embryos, and maybe potential societal impacts?
And a utilitarian might also think about where resources go, right? Like, could the money spent on, say, multiple rounds of expensive IVF create more overall good if spent elsewhere?
Exactly. That's a key utilitarian consideration, opportunity cost. Is this the best use of resources for maximizing overall well-being? Then you have Kantian ethics. Kant's big thing was treating people always as ends in themselves, never merely as a means to an end.
So how does that apply here?
Well, critics using a Kantian lens might argue that things like commercial surrogacy or creating a savior sibling risk treating the child as a product or a tool to fulfill the parent's desires, using the child merely as a means.
Is there a Kantian defense of art?
Yes, the defense usually focuses on intention. It argues that couples using art fully intend to love and cherish the resulting child as a person, as an end in themselves once they exist. So even if the method might seem instrumental, the ultimate relationship planned is one of respect for the person.
Okay, and the third main view, natural law theory.
Right. Particularly the interpretation common in Roman Catholic thought. This perspective is generally the most restrictive.
Yeah.
Natural law theory typically rejects all art, IVF, surrogacy, cloning. Why? Well, several reasons. First, it argues these technologies separate procreation from the sexual union within marriage, breaking what's seen as a natural God-given link. Second, procedures like IVF often involve creating and destroying embryos, which, from this perspective, have a right to life from conception. And third, involving third parties, like sperm egg donors or surrogates, is seen as potentially undermining the integrity and exclusivity of marriage.
So a real spectrum of views, from seeing RT as largely permissible if harms are managed, to rejecting it entirely on principle.
That sums it up well, and it really boils down to this central conflict in reproductive ethics. You have a very strong default presumption in favor of procreative liberty, the freedom to have children. So the burden of proof usually falls on those who want to restrict RT, surrogacy, or cloning. They need to demonstrate substantial, tangible harm, real harm to the child, the woman, or society, to justify overriding that basic freedom.
Which brings us back to that final challenging thought. Considering the non-identity problem, is a burdened life better than no life? And thinking about the huge resources, the money, the medical effort poured into art, does that deep desire for a biologically related child carry enough moral weight to justify all those costs and risks? Or, from a societal view, should we maybe prioritize allocating those resources differently, perhaps helping existing people facing hardship?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
It forces us to weigh individual desires against broader social good, especially when technology pushes the boundaries so rapidly,
Yeah.
often faster than our ethical consensus can keep up.
A really powerful place to pause and reflect. This has been a fascinating and definitely complex deep dive into reproductive technology and its ethics. Thank you for walking us through it.
My pleasure. And a warm thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team.